are here with Mike Pollock, Managing Director of Spectrum Gaming Group. And Mike, thank you for joining us again this year. And as we typically say, you have a unique perspective on gaming because your consultancy firm is so broad in perspective. You cover basically every facet of the industry, including legislative and U.S. regulatory bodies. So from that broad perspective, can you point to a couple of trends that you see upcoming this year?
Sure. It's important that you mention regulatory and also legislative, because anyone who's been involved in the gaming industry a long time knows that it all begins and potentially ends with the policymakers, and gaming in the United States is regulated at the state level. So what legislators are thinking and what regulators are doing is of paramount importance. And really what we're seeing right now is that more and more states are focusing on a few things. One is, how do they increase tax revenues? Because as this conference is taking place in almost every state, we just ended one fiscal year and we're entering a new one. And states are required, unlike the federal government, to balance their budgets. And they often have to balance their budgets on the backs of the casino industry. And it's interesting, that's not a partisan issue. That's something Republicans and Democrats both will often do. So what we're seeing is states are looking at, how to expand gaming within their states. And that includes, in some instances, they're looking at adding new licenses. They're looking at expanding the types of gaming. In some instances, they're looking at increasing the tax, even, for example, taxing free play and things like that. And most important is that they're looking at iGaming and potentially sports betting as something that will be enormous revenue producers over the coming months and years. If this, I may be anticipating next question, but if this Supreme Court decision before the U.S. Supreme Court right now, the Christie case, right. Depending on how that rules, that could just be like a dam bursting in terms of what states will do.
Outside of iGaming and raising taxes, as you mentioned, there has been another trend that we see in the legislature is this idea of expanding slot routes, especially in Pennsylvania. Is that something you can speak on?
Certainly. That's something we've studied in a number of states. And Ashley, as you know, Spectrum is the executive director for the National Council of Legislators from Gaming States. And that's one of the core issues that legislators around the country, not just Pennsylvania, are looking at. Because on paper, that seems like a great way to generate revenue. Our position, we're neither for nor against that. We just try to put it in perspective. Slot routes can generate some increased revenue for the states. There's no question about that. But the real question they need to ask is it good public policy? How much employment does it create? What does it do to the potential investment and employment levels at existing casinos within those states? And these are questions that regulators and legislators, in particular legislators, often don't ask. They don't think about these things because it's more than just a question of straight revenue, multiplying the number of machines by the win per unit and saying this is our increased revenue, this is what how we're going to balance our budget. We're urging them to look beyond that. So I'm not going to say it's good policy or bad policy. It depends on the state, number one. But there probably are other routes to go. You mentioned Pennsylvania, and I was quoted in a Pennsylvania newspaper recently, and I'll stand by that quote, where I said that the worst reason to expand gaming is to balance this year's budget. Absolutely stand by that, because when you take any number of steps, including establishing routes, these are permanent steps. You don't undo them, not easily. You better know what you're doing and why you're doing it and what its impact is going to be.
And, you know, that kind of brings me to the question that a couple of years ago, there's industries now that didn't exist a couple years ago. I think of daily fantasy sports, I think of esports. So in that arena, how does Spectrum see the future of those types of gaming?
It's the future of gaming in every sense. Gaming, we've always known that gaming was evolving, and gaming is always going to be evolving. But the areas that you mentioned, and there's probably other areas that when we have this discussion next year, hopefully, we'll be discussing as well that aren't even on the radar yet. But there's all sorts of implications and inferences to come from that, including, you mentioned esports and the daily fantasy sports, and you can add skill-based and a lot of other things to that. Where do these areas of gaming that have historically operated in silos, how do they function? Will they converge or will they collide? And I'm specifically referring to, let's say, casinos on one hand, lotteries on the other, pari-mutuels as a third area, OTBs, and a lot of other things that, again, this is going to, policymakers really need to think deeply and think about the implications of that, because it is going to, it's going to affect every state. There's not going to be a single exception to it, whether it's Indian gaming or commercial gaming, or in some instances, states that really have no gaming at all, but have lotteries. Mm-hmm. No casino game, but have lotteries.
So on the lottery side, where are we at in terms of how much growth is there in traditional lottery sales? Or are we going to start looking at things like the sale of lottery tickets all over the internet, more broad-based in the U.S.?
Certainly, lotteries like just traditional casino gaming are seeing their demographics. The best sign that you're not reaching new customers is that every year your average age goes up by a year. That just essentially means that your customers are falling off the escalator of life and you got to replace them with new customers. So lotteries are no different. And so lotteries are absolutely going to be looking at iGaming as a way to expand their demographic reach. What they're facing right now in most states is resistance from the retailers, the 7-Elevens and gas stations and so forth. But that resistance can and will be overcome. Then the question becomes, is it a lottery or a casino? Because if you look at, for example, the Michigan lottery is now online, fairly full service online lottery. And if you look at what would be considered an instant ticket online, and you look at a slot machine online, I live in New Jersey, so you can see, you can play online. They're virtually identical. There is no difference from the player's standpoint. What does that mean? Are we creating competitors where they do not now exist because they're both going to be foraging for new customers? That has to be addressed. That's a policymaker's biggest issue, but it's, with few exceptions, it's really not on their radar.
So we've talked about the evolving nature of the gaming industry. What does the industry look like in 5 years, and are there winners and losers? What does Spectrum see?
Well, there certainly obviously will be winners and losers, and one of the things we see, and we're talking about this in a number of states, and this is something that you could theoretically address in almost every state, is the tax rate on gaming is going to help determine who the winners and losers are. As you know, both Fantini and Spectrum are based in the Northeast, so we see it firsthand, the saturation issue. How do you address that? One of the ways you address that is by allowing casinos to develop a different business model than their traditional convenience-based model. You can't do that without a more effective, smarter tax rate. And that's going to help determine the winners and losers. My suggestion is that the states that have enough foresight and political courage, not just to lower the tax rate, it isn't just a question of lowering the tax rate. We are encouraging that, but the quid pro quo is, if you want to determine winners in your state, give them a more effective tax rate, but in return, they have to invest in their properties and develop a new business model. The traditional convenience-based business model is going to be of limited value, particularly in an online world.
Well, Mike, thank you again for joining us, and we appreciate your continued insight.
It's my pleasure.